Hello and welcome to WION Live Conversation. Today we will discuss Ukraine's ongoing plea to use Western-supplied long-range missiles to target deep inside Russia. In the latest, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer did not signal any decision on allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned that if Kyiv gets the green light to strike deep inside Russia, then it would mean NATO's direct participation in the ongoing war. To discuss all of this and much more, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Senior Analyst and also Capability at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's joining us live from Canberra. Thank you so much for being here with us on WION, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Dr. Malcolm, there are talks doing the rounds in Washington, D.C. after Starmer's visit of Kyiv being allowed to use Western-supplied long-range missiles to target deep inside Russia. I want to first start by asking that, do you think that the West is responding to Iran supplying ballistic missiles to Russia by lifting these restrictions on Kyiv and allowing Ukraine to use its weapons to strike deep inside Russia?
Well, certainly the Iranian decision to supply the Fateh ballistic missiles is a serious escalation on the part of Iran and Russia of the Ukraine war. And I think the West was justified then in reviewing its stance on how Ukraine gets to use US and European supplied long-range missiles in response. So yeah, this is very much a response to Russian and Iranian escalation of the war.
And how might the lifting of the restrictions on Kyiv, because we've seen in the past few months how the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading the Western powers to allow Kyiv to use Western-supplied long-range missiles to target Russia. If Kyiv is allowed to use the long-range missiles, how do you think that will change the course of the war?
Well, firstly, those constraints have to be lifted, and at the moment, it's still not clear what the Biden administration has decided in that regard. The indications are that Biden is probably going to allow the UK and France to provide the weapons called Storm Shadow and Scalp that the Ukrainians can then use against targets deep inside Russia. But it's also suggested that the US is not going to allow Ukraine to use the ATACMS missiles, which the US has supplied. In terms of how that affects the war, it will certainly make life much tougher for the Russians in terms of their ability to launch attacks on Ukraine. The Scalp and the Storm Shadow missiles that are air-launched have a much greater range, anything up to 500 kilometers. So those missiles could be used to attack critical airfields that the Russians are currently employing to attack targets in Ukraine. And then really the question is, how do the Russians respond if those missiles are used?
Right. You do speak of how the Russians will respond if Kyiv is allowed to use those long-range missiles. Just a few hours ago, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said that if Kyiv is allowed to use long-range missiles, then it will mean that NATO is directly participating in the ongoing war, and it will be more like NATO versus Moscow. And he has also warned of taking appropriate action. What could that be?
Well, seriously, I don't think he's going to attack NATO because he knows what that means. If he actually launches an attack directly on a NATO state, Article 5 comes into play. An attack on one NATO state is an attack on all. And so therefore, Russia is at war with NATO. And I think Russia would decisively lose that war. If he's talking about potentially escalating to tactical nuclear weapons, then he knows what the end result of that would be in terms of escalation to strategic nuclear war. And all sides are devastated then. So I think these are empty threats. I think that he's blustering. I think he's trying to intimidate and sow fear amongst Western decision makers to try and constrain their willingness to allow Ukraine to fight back. And I think it's important that Western decision makers, including President Biden, not succumb to that fear and that intimidation. Those missiles should be allowed to be used to their full range against Russian targets. And I don't think Russia will strike at NATO.
Right, and Biden just said that he does not think much of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has perhaps dismissed all the warnings by the Russian president. What do you make of that?
Well, obviously, the US and its allies will be looking at what the Russians are doing. If they're seeing indications, for example, that the Russians are moving around tactical nuclear weapons or elevating alert status of those weapons, perhaps removing weapons from storage sites and deploying them to operational units, then we would take that much more seriously. But we're not seeing any signs of that at this point in time. And in terms of attacks on NATO with conventional Russian forces, NATO, I think, is very well placed to defend against such attacks if the Russians were stupid enough to do such a thing. So I think that the Biden administration, the British government, the French government, and the rest of NATO will be watching very closely what the Russians do, and they'll be on alert. But I don't think they'll dismiss it out of hand. I think that they're sensible enough to know that the Russians could do something silly, but they probably won't, because the Russians' main interest is in self-preservation, and in particular, Putin's own grip on power. And he knows that if he escalates this war too far, then he will not only lose his country, but he will lose his own life, in effect.
Right, last question to you, Dr. Malcolm, before we let you go. Your assessment of Germany backing off at this point of time and saying that they will not supply long-range missiles to Ukraine.
Germany has the Taurus missile, which is based very similar to Storm Shadow and Scalp. It's very disappointing that the Germans are doing this. They consistently backpedal and bow to the Russians. They are clearly intimidated by the Russians. And I think that that's a real shame, because they are a key NATO member. And so it does raise questions about their dependence, their being a dependent sort of partner. In a crisis. Will they actually back down and blink, or will they stand firm? I don't know about the Germans, but I do know about countries like France, about the UK, about Poland, about the Baltic states. They will stand firm. And so I think that Chancellor Scholz does NATO a disservice by constantly bowing before Putin.
Right, Dr. Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us on WION Live Conversation with your insights.
Thank you.
Okay. In a big win for India, China has said that its troops have disengaged at 4 places of standoff in eastern Ladakh, including the Galwan Valley. In a press briefing on Friday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Nining highlighted that in recent years, frontline armies of both the countries have disengaged in 4 areas in the western sector of the China-India border, including the Galwan Valley. Meanwhile, India's External Affairs Ministry also released a statement saying that India and China have agreed to work with urgency and redouble their efforts to achieve complete disengagement in the remaining friction points in eastern Ladakh.